You are listening to Specifically for Seniors, a podcast designed for a vibrant and diverse senior community. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Barsh. Join me and a lineup of experts as we discuss a wide variety of topics that will empower, inform, entertain, and inspire as we celebrate the richness and wisdom of this incredible stage of life. My guest today on Specifically for Seniors caught my attention in an opinion piece in the Washington Post. Professors Ben Katz and Pamela Teaster urged, quote, an objective scientific conversation about mental and physiological aging, both for our leaders and for the rapidly aging populations around the world, realizing that these conversations are both difficult and obligatory. We're going to try to at least open that conversation here on Specifically for Seniors today. Both Ben Katz and Pamela Teaster are part of the Faculty of Human Development and Family Science at Virginia Tech. Pamela Teaster is also director of the Virginia Tech Center for Gerontology and on the editorial board of the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect. She is a fellow of both the Gerontological Society of America and the Association for Gerontology in Higher Education. Pamela is an active board member and former president of the National Committee for the Prevention of Elder Abuse. Ben and Pamela, welcome to Specifically for Seniors.
Great to be here.
I'd like to get started by asking each of you to introduce us to your principal areas of research focus. Ben, do you want to start?
I'm happy to. So my background is in really cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology. So I study the development of these processes we call executive function. So the skills that you need to learn, reason, think, and decide, like working memory, holding information in mind, using it to solve a problem, or inhibitory control, stopping yourself from doing something when it's inappropriate over the entire lifespan. So that includes in working age adults and younger adults and children, as well as a lot of my research focuses on aging as well. And that's the core of what I do. And I study both how those processes develop over the whole life course, but also how they can be modulated from through experience and intervention.
And Pamela?
So my degree is in public administration and public affairs with a certificate in gerontology. I've always been interested in aging policy. The bulk of my work has been on surrogate decision making, and that would be powers of attorney and a lot on guardianship. Also, another strand that I have is on elder abuse, and it's really been all types: opioid abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence for older adults, all that sort of thing. And then I'm also a bioethicist.
As a start, let's talk about the perception of aging in the younger population in general and in the media. What have you both found is the perception of older adults?
Do you want to start, Pam?
Oh, I was going to let you.
I mean, either way is fine. I think Pam, as she'll mention, I'm sure, has long thought about this, and she's actually spoken in my class about this, I think, or maybe she's spoken to our students about this quite a bit. Pam, you can talk more about that class that you're working on, but it's not really just in the media, right? These are things that we see that are pervasive throughout entertainment formats like TV and film, right? And while there, of course, are some very positive depictions of aging, right, there are a lot of depictions that reinforce negative stereotypes, right? As people getting slower, not able to do certain things. And this was the sort of thing that sparked us again, right? Just seeing how many times the term senior moment was used in the news media leading up to this. And sure, it was used by some people who would probably have the defense of being comedians like Jon Stewart, but I also saw it in a lot of opinion pieces in tons of other outlets as well. I'm interested to hear what Pam has been thinking about too.
Um, so, so Ben is exactly right. And as early as graduate school, when I was not even finished, we were working on issues of aging in the media, and we called one of our really early presentations with one of my fellow graduate students, "Real versus Real," REEL versus REAL. So we've been working on this, thinking about this issue for, oh gosh, at least the late '90s, early 2000s. Of just the media issues. And Ben is exactly right that what we see is what we emulate. And there's even science behind that. So if you think that aging means slowing down, and you think that aging means cognitive loss that Ben can measure, you you know what you see is what you get. So if you see it, you believe it, and that's sort of that problem with that. And it it's not just a perception, it's not just what you look at, but it actually affects your health and your healthcare treatment and your treatment of others, and then that affects your quality of life and those around you.
And we're sort of looked at as a homogeneous group with similar interests and just similar backgrounds, which just isn't true.
I find that funny because I had a probably long dinner with a good friend of mine, arguing that aging was the ultimate heterogeneity. And he was not quite buying that. He was more of a studied children, and I was like, no, older people have had longer to develop their personalities. They've had longer lives. They've had longer experiences than any other population on the planet, except maybe tortoises, the Galapagos tortoises. They live longer than us. So they would become more differentiated over time than maybe become less.
Yeah, we that's and there's so much research backing this up across multiple dimensions of aging, right? It's actually where we see the most heterogeneity. So there's incredible variance across people, us our entire lives, but especially as we get older in things like cognition and a wide variety of other functional capacities and things like that.
And what do we have to do to overcome in order to gain understanding? Do people have a fear of older people or a loathing of older people? What?
The fear of older people because they fear getting old. We see it in products. There was something that was just on Consumer Report this morning that said, here are the anti-aging things you might want to try. Anti-aging? What would the opposite be of anti-aging, right? And so when that gets in the population, when that permeates everything we do, then people have a real fear of getting old. Do I look old? Do I look old? Am I eight? And I think the best thing we can do, Ben can talk about this far better than me, is that we can say that everybody's been aging since you were born. And that is just a continuation of what you've been doing across the lifespan. And I think, Ben, you tell me what you think. I think that's the best approach that I've ever had work with law. I just tried it with a friend of mine used it in her elder law class just this spring. So I think if we can begin to sort of see that, you see, you're all sort of on this journey. And of course, there's a terminus because there's always a terminus, and we don't live forever. We never will. At least I can't imagine it. Anyway, Ben, I'll let you take it from there.
No, Pam, I totally agree. So most of my experiences from this, where this really was hit home for me, is I teach one of the classes is anecdotal, but I would guess this is consistent. I teach an introduction to aging class within our department. And for a lot of the undergraduates in that class, they absolutely report. I ask them, what do you hope to get out of this? How do you feel about aging? We have a little survey that we give them in the very beginning. And almost every student, I would say it's upwards of 70 or 80%, so a lot of the students respond saying that they're afraid of aging. They don't know that much about it. That's part of that, right? And they also don't always have a lot of contact with older adults. You think about how much contact people have with their grandparents. That might be the one person in their, two people in their life that they actually, or four people in their life they talk to. But not even all the students actually see them that frequently. So it's this mix of being afraid of it, but I think that fear a lot of times coming from not having exposure or discussions about it early. And they really aren't. A lot of times that class is the very first time they think about things like, Where do they want to live when they're older? What are things they might plan for themselves? I think that this is the sort of thing where more conversations about it would be helpful, especially like for my undergrads. But at the end of the class, I ask them again, and that fear usually drops a whole bunch just because they've spent a whole semester thinking and talking about it.
Same thing for me. We did a project that during COVID, as a matter of fact, called COVID Companions. And of course, we were trying to help older adults who were becoming socially isolated and trying to help them. We gave them a pad. We got monies from the government for that, for where we live. And they really like stood on the steps of people's houses and tried to help them get connectivity. And when we did the research on how that had affected them, the students just did exactly what Ben said. They said they really got more comfortable with older people. They got more comfortable with their own aging. And I thought, if not only was that a great project because it helped people with their social isolation, but it really helped younger people connect with older people and see that there's a whole life out there past 21.
And on the other side, our perception of what the younger people think of us is biased based on our conversations with our grandchildren who have a different connection than most other people. What do you feel has contributed to the ageist rhetoric and characteristics of aging in public opinions, especially in the media, especially in relation to this election coming up?
Oh, that's a lot to unpack, right? I mean,
is this going to be longer than your usual ones?
I know Pam has a lot of thoughts on this. I mean, for me, it always comes back to how many protected classes do we talk about in this way, right? Why and why that's okay, right? I think is a complicated question that definitely goes way back before this single election, right? It sort of got brought into the forefront because now, we had a situation where at one point, right, there were two candidates that would both be the oldest running for or election or re-election, right? But sort of why that's okay and why it continues to be something that is okay is something that I think is hard to unpack. So I'm curious to hear what Pam says, but I do think that is going to change, and I have a very strong reason why I think that's going to change. And I think you can look at demographic trends for a pretty quick introduction to what's about to happen there. But Pam, I'm curious to hear what you think about as far as why, like, sort of some of the contributing factors to why that's so pervasive now.
I think our culture has been one of a youth culture. We have really loved trying to stay as young as possible, and I think that all sort. Again, I mentioned that slightly. All sorts of products to try to do that. All sorts of things to make you feel young, and just go run the gamut of those that you can just put in your head. So, and then I think there's another factor at work too. And I had another long discussion with a friend of mine who was in his 90s. It was one of my professors. And society, we have not, as a whole population, at the population level, we have not lived that long. Remember, it was the 1900s. We all remember that because we were all born during that period. You were right, Ben. And so it was that period that generally the lifespan was about 40. People did live. Now, it wasn't to say that people didn't live a long time, but we're talking about the average lifespan was about 40. Well, that's about a century. Only a century in time that people have lived that long, and that's not true globally either. So I think just understanding what to do with a group of people who are aging. For example, Larry, we changed the retirement age, right? Is it fair to everyone? Of course it isn't. But we've even changed that so that a person who would turn 65 this year isn't going to be able to retire at 65 like other generations did. It's 67. It's a population aging issue.
So, where do we start this conversation on aging?
All the time. I think we talk about it with our kids. I think we do what Ben does in his class. I think we have podcasts. I think we write about it. I think we do what we did in the Washington Post. I think we say, here is a conversation, but it's the wrong conversation that we're watching this nationally. And the most horrid thing, when we think about what we saw about only a month ago, they were some of the most horrible things that people said about people getting old. Just awful. Watching somebody shuffle, doing the walking check. I mean, it was really some of the most ageist rhetoric I have ever witnessed. It was embarrassing as a gerontologist to think that we had slipped back that far. And I think Ben thinks the same.
And that's, I think that's why, so I think, yeah, having those conversations is important. That has to be part of it. And we have to engage more people in those conversations, right? So it has to be something that's happening on TV, on television shows, and not just news shows, right? But also people that are creating entertainment media. And it's not universal, right, that there's bad depictions, right? You can just this right, last month, Thelma, there was a great movie that came out that had a very different approach to depicting some of that. And so I think that it has to happen at many different levels in order for it to be successful as well, because this is something that's taken a long time to sort of, I guess, form as well, given what Pam said about how we've only had people that have been that old in society, at a larger percentage relatively recently.
Yesterday, for example, and you might hear your podcast. I was in the airport, and there was an older gentleman who was sitting, he was chatty, right? Because we were waiting at the gate at the airport, and he said, what do you do? And I went, well, actually, I'm a gerontologist. And I said, I don't always know that people know what that means, but and I said, so I study older adults. He clearly was an older adult, and I went, I love being around old people. And he was taken back by that, I think, a little, but I think that is sort of a way to approach that is to do just what you said, to say, actually, I like them very much.
And just so, like, one quick thing we do in my class, right? It's not just about having a conversation about it, right? They have to do a field study in that class, and for most of them, what that means is working at either we have a adult day service center at Virginia Tech. There's a local continuing care community that many students work at. And for many of those students, it's the very first time, right, engaging with older adults who are not their grandparents. I get that from them a lot. And their experience during that is transformative, because they come out of that understanding that heterogeneity that you mentioned earlier, right? And also understanding how rewarding those experiences are, right? They come out of those experiences with mentors, with friends, they never would have thought of in those types of capacities did they not engage with that.
I don't particularly think of myself as an older adult. One story, I was on an airport bus with my son, and we were leaning against the baggage rack because there were no seats. When one of the guys sitting down looked at me, stood up, and said, "Excuse me, sir, would you like to sit down?" My son started laughing hysterically, and I just sort of was taken aback by that. I, it's just a very strange feeling on this end as well.
That really connects to what we were talking about before, that it's so much self-perceptions. And there is so much research on this, right? That there are things that can either reinforce or challenge those types of stereotypes or those perceptions we have of ourselves. And I guess it's a positive thing, right? That it's not great that in that moment you're like, oh man, does somebody see me this way? But it's probably also a positive thing that you don't always see yourself that way. I am the same way. My students remind me that I'm not I'm sort of midway through life, but I always still see myself as a college student or whatever, and my students remind me that I'm not. If I wasn't in front of them, I probably wouldn't feel that way either. But there's so many things. That's why we have to be so mindful about all the different places where we can reinforce those perceptions.
Many facilities will put a picture beside on the door of a person in a facility. They put a picture of them much younger, so that when staff are providing care for them, that they can remember that here's this person who's lived this life, and we're not just seeing them not well or needing lots of care. This was a person who had a full life, who had all kinds of experiences, and I think that helps with humanizing the aging experience. But I've been to many facilities both for studying and visiting people, and I always kind of like that approach. That here's a person who had a whole life. They weren't just they didn't just start being a person with problems. They started as a young person.
In getting back to the presidential race before Joe Biden dropped out, uh, your expertise is in the field of lifespan cognition. Where do we stand in understanding that?
So we've made really amazing strides going back to decades ago, but especially in the last 20 years or so, understanding that heterogeneity. So the fact that there's not only differences between people, right, in the course of aging, and when I say the course of aging, I mean the social, psychological, physical, cognitive, mental, right? But there's also a ton of variance, within ourselves. As we have positive things that happen that can, sort of reinforce uh, and provide the foundations of support, and also we have have challenges to health and things like that. And I think what's been useful about that, and that work really, so my work is sort of overlaps both cognition, so that's like studying behavior, but also the neuroscience behind that, so understanding what actually happens in the brain. And both of those areas of research are sort of mutually beneficial. And so going back to your question about how was that improvement, maybe how is that sort of increase in knowledge maybe relate to the election, for example, it's one of the reasons why when people talk about first of all, so I think, you kind of had all these people saying the president should take a cognitive test or something like that. Most of the time they're referring to the MOCA. This is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It's a very standard global test of cognition, right? And I feel two ways around that. On one hand, anyone who's not a physician of the president or of that person should probably not be speculating about that. But the other way around it is we're afraid, right, sometimes of these types of tests. They are not sensitive enough to give you very fine detail about whether you're a high performer or a low performer. They are a screening tool, right? But they also shouldn't be something to be afraid of, right? We've kind of, because we have all of this other rhetoric around aging, we think of that as something of like, oh no, if I'm not doing as well in this as I should be, it's sort of seen as something so negative that people don't often take those tests. And the reason that that's really not so great is because a lot of the time, or a significant percentage of the time, right, it's not like it's always an indicator that somebody has Alzheimer's or dementia or mild cognitive impairment, even, which might precede that. Sometimes it can actually highlight other health issues. For example, having hypertension, if it's unmedicated, can actually be a cause of mild cognitive impairment or things like that. And so one of the things for me is we have these great tests that have become more pervasive in the last 20 years that are parts of our ways of studying cognition over the lifespan. And we need to be more thoughtful about how we use them more frequently, and also do a better job of communicating that this is part of a standard checkup, for example, for people that we should be taking way before. The problem is you give it to somebody when they're 65. You don't have a cognitive test until then, right? You see that, well, that's something that just happens when I get older. I don't, whatever else. So we need to have conversations about it earlier, and it needs to be something that's normalized.
So how come the questions never change?
That's another huge part. Do you mean the questions on the tests or
On
the
the
questions on
test,
the?
it is so standardized. I've taken the MOCA test several times, and I've sort of memorized the answers.
So Larry, that's such a great point. You've highlighted something that's so frustrating to me. And this is work that I'm doing with somebody else at Virginia Tech, Laura Sands, one of my great colleagues. So, right, that test, that test is not designed to examine that variability over time, right? It's designed to be given at like a single time point, right? Which I think is very self-defeating. What you need to do is to make multiple, there are some that they have multiple versions, but they need to have multiple versions, right? That you norm and go through all the things you would do to make sure that it's a valid measure, but you need to be a reliable measure. But you need to have multiple versions of those types of assessments because you're absolutely right. There are retest effects. There are all these other issues, but they very rarely do that because we don't always see cognition. People understand, oh, there's going to be some decline, right? But we need to think about that as something that changes more frequently than we might think, not only over like years and months, but actually from day to day. That's other work we're doing in our lab too. And I think once you understand that, you see that you need to have the ability to be able to administer a test where the questions are different all the time. And you could give it maybe once a month instead of if somebody needed it that way, rather than just one single time point. I think there are people who are working on this. There are, but there's not a good standardized version of any of those tests that you can really administer exceptionally frequently to look at variation in cognition. It's really a very blunt instrument, I guess, so to speak.
Pamela, where do we stand in your field of expertise?
Not so great, as a matter of fact. So, like Ben, people would take cognitive tests, for example, when some things would happen that I study. And I think I talked about these issues of elder mistreatment and these issues of guardianship and also end of life. They are all sort of in one bundle. So, no big surprise that I became a bioethicist. And I just want to say, I didn't become a bioethicist when I was getting my PhD. I finished that in 2021. So I really went back to school and got another degree. And not as a friend of mine said, not as a spring chicken, probably a fall chicken. And so I didn't go to school. I went back to school, and I even talked to Ben about that. Do you think I had to take a test, right? I haven't taken a test since like various, maybe the Clinton administration, because I don't take tests as a graduate student. We take papers. So I had to ask Ben. I was like, so could you remind me how you take like standardized tests? Because I've forgotten that. I don't do that anymore. And so I even went to Ben over this thinking, gosh, this is out of my comfort zone because I simply don't do it. My students laughed about this because they do it all the time. This highlights another issue that Ben would talk about. Not only are we taking cognitive tests, but he would also say to you that we do not take tests like my 15-year-old takes tests. Every day they take a test on something. They're really fast at it. They're really used to it, but we get less used to that because we're not practiced at it anymore too. But back to elder abuse and so. Oh, Ben, say something.
No, I was just gonna say. By the way, Pam didn't mention this, but she did ace that test too.
I did.
And that's what our research in our lab shows. Actually, even if it might take a little bit longer to learn or something because we are maybe out of practice or whatever else, everyone, right? We have research going right up until the later years in life. Everyone has the capacity to learn and to improve. Almost everyone has the capacity to learn and improve. It's really, it may take a little bit longer, but really we are able to see performance that's very, very high if people are able to study and practice.
It's true. As far as treatment of old people, you see that ageist problem permeates how we treat them, and that's really where I study and live. And so that becomes why it seems to be okay to scam older people, because that's okay. They got a cognitive problem; they'll never miss it. Why it would be okay to mistreat a vulnerable person? Why somebody would think that was the thing to do because they've got money, they'll never miss it. And so actually the scam problem is getting worse than better. And that again does it reflect the society's getting worse? I doubt it. What does it reflect? A population of people who are a larger population of people. So if there's elder abuse 10, 20 years ago, there's more of it unless we've been able to really stop that, because simply there are more older people to abuse, right, in the population. So the sheer numbers are going to go up. But the occasion has gotten more complicated. And I think a lot of that, at least on the scam side, scams and fraud side, is the really wonderful computer and AI is beginning to make some of that more frightening. And I think that movie Thelma that Ben talked about is just an example of that we can replicate your grandchildren's voices now, right? We can send email. All of us are getting that, where it's not what we're expecting that somebody sends. A friend of mine sent me something, faculty, Ben, you may have gotten one. A friend, like, where are you? This was the message. Well, where was I? I was like, I'm in Hawaii. What do you need? And I thought that was a little odd that I never heard back from them. But it turned out this morning I found it was a scam. And so we're beginning to see more of that. Well, you have many mechanisms that we can have people help us figure out if they are. Like my colleague will tell me that was a scam. But older people don't necessarily, because if they're not in the workforce, they might not have an IT person to help them and so forth. The guardianship issue, there are people in the world who think, as we discussed, Larry, that think that guardianship should not exist at all. I wouldn't be one of them, but I think that too often we have taken away people's civil rights too quickly, and not with enough cognitive testing, and life course understanding before we start removing civil rights in the name of protection.
I personally, I received one of those grandparent scams. Oh, Grandpa, I've been arrested. I was driving. I was drunk. It's they do it well. It almost did sound like my granddaughter until I asked them what her middle name was, and then they sort of dropped
They had
out.
no clue. And
Um,
we know that I was reading an article actually not about a week ago, and I was learning that many of those places people are captives, and they're groomed to have to do those kinds of scam calls. They're beaten if they don't hook somebody. And so I'm not excusing it, but I'm just saying there's more on the other end of what's going on than I even knew about as much until I had read some more about that article. This is a person who had escaped.
yeah. We talked a bit about gerontology, and what I've noticed recently, I've begun seeing a gerontologist, a geriatrician, and the approach to medical care is completely different than than a regular internist or family physician. The approach is more about how and what we expect out of the remainder of our lives. Do you
I
have?
just had this same conversation with my wife because she was sort of asking. We have several friends who are physicians, and most of them are general practitioners, family practice. But she was sort of like, well, what's the point of having a geriatrician? And it was it was like, well, many people, it was about the training that they receive, right? And that's actually something where there's still a lot of room to improve. I'm sure you've talked to geriatricians, and that's a whole separate field. Uh, I'm on the editorial board for geriatrics and gerontology education, and that's a space where helping people understand what that. So you mentioning that is a really positive thing, right? Because that experience of thinking about aging more holistically, thinking about it as an additive thing, what you want to have happen or experience or be able to do, rather than loss, right? Rather than really limitations, I think is something that not everyone experiences. They certainly don't always experience that in medical school, right? And there's a lot of variance in what those training programs look like. But that's another one of those places, right, where we need to have more conversations about that, and where there's probably a lot of room for gerontologists and geriatricians to work together in thinking about that type of training. I think having it happen in medical school when somebody's in an advanced professional program is too late. I think for me, it really needs to happen in undergrad, or even, right, where's one place where we don't have really any gerontology education at all is in high schools or K through 12, right? We do a terrible job of including that kind of content there. So I think it really needs to start much earlier to promote those kind of very positive ways of thinking about aging.
As a retired dentist, I can say the same thing happens in dentistry. We don't understand the need of the individual, the older individual, uh, as opposed to our need to create a complete functioning dentition in somebody who's 85 or 90 years old. I remember I had one patient who came to me when she was 90, 91, and she needed endodontic root canal treatment on 4 lower teeth that were not bothering her. And I couldn't understand at the time why she didn't accept treatment. She died at 99 with the same 4 teeth with the same problem that never bothered her. And this is something that I've begun to understand from my experience with a geriatrician.
But that also highlights, right? So I think the fact that there are so many people specializing in geriatrics is very positive, but you also have highlighted areas where probably, there, and I'm sure some of this is happening, but there needs to be even, additional training both in, dentistry is another place, right, where there's probably lots of opportunities, also probably in optometry and ophthalmologists. That's probably another space where there's probably a lot of room to improve education there as well. And I think those are places, right, where oftentimes is sometimes later to the game than other fields of medicine, unfortunately.
So, how do we start these conversations nationally? How do we get started on bringing this out to a broader population?
I think what I think Ben and I and our colleague Al, I think we're a good example of that. That when there's an occasion that presents itself, you take it if you can possibly do it, and start saying, we need to talk about this a lot earlier. We need to think about what the ramifications are on a societal level for what you're seeing right now. How does that affect how we think about older leaders? Are we going to watch them all to see when they're declining and then start saying that we don't need sages that which we built out in the Constitution to have because we knew that people who were older possessed this great wisdom. We knew that in the 1700s. And so I think we take every opportunity we can to insert this conversation in our lives. And like Ben said earlier, so my kids, of course, would have been exposed to this very early in their life. They have a very different view of aging because they've heard people talking about it since they were little. And I think I think they really do have a different approach to it. One of their other approaches, maybe they're tired of hearing about it. But that would be unusual. Ben, you probably have other things to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be holistic, right? So so in my role, my small place, right? I know that with my undergraduate students, I can do that, and maybe to some degree, I can promote through my service and work in the editorial board and things like that, right? Better studies and papers that really investigate how to do this across more educational institutions and things like that. But it has to happen in other places too, right? I think Pam can speak a lot to policy, right? There are some cool initiatives and things that like Pam has participated in with trying to get more gerontologists or geriatricians involved in the development of aging policy, right? That's a place where, so for example, if we don't think a conversation like that is happening in high schools, right, that's probably a much larger set of work that needs to happen to say, well, maybe we can put this in some standards or there's some ways where in a certain state this can be something that makes sure it comes up in a health class or something like that. In my health class, we didn't talk about aging. I vaguely remember it from high school, but it didn't come up at all, which seems ridiculous. And then also, I think, when you think about in the media, right, there needs to be one of those things is just oftentimes a lack of awareness that there are people who can come and speak up about these issues, right? And when I looked at who wrote op-eds after this happened, you saw a lot of physicians and a lot of geriatricians write op-eds, and that's fantastic, right? But there were very few from gerontologists. And I think this is probably a situation where most people don't even know what a gerontologist really does, even though there's a massive organization for them and tons of people who do this. I think this is something where we can be afraid to speak up, but we have to do it, because if we don't, those types of voices and these types of perspectives are going to be missing from those conversations. And you're going to see that negative rhetoric just reinforced because no one is going to stop somebody and say, well, let's talk about this. Are you really mean to say that somebody's old? Or you want to have a different conversation about functioning or performance, right? Because you can have that conversations about the reasons why somebody might not be able to do something that doesn't just say because they're old. Because let me tell you, there's lots, no matter what it is, there's a lot of people who may be older who could still do that, right? And so you really have to think about the sort of language you're using. So I think that we have to step up, and that's what Pam was saying too.
That's an interesting point. Do you want to explain the difference between a geriatrician and a gerontologist?
Oh my goodness, I'll give it a shot, and Pam, jump in. I better be able to do this since I'm one of those things. So yeah, I think it's pretty simple, right? A geriatrician, it typically refers to a physician, right, or someone in medicine who specifically is trained to, or at least works with, most frequently, right, older adult or aging populations. That doesn't mean they only work in those contexts, but that may be a focus or special skill of theirs. Whereas a gerontologist, and there of course can be people who consider themselves both geriatricians and gerontologists, but a gerontologist is just somebody who has a special interest in studies, typically an academic from that kind of perspective, but it doesn't have to be just in that setting, right? Aging from a wide variety of perspectives. So it could be somebody who studies social aspects of it. It could be someone who studies cognitive or physical aspects of it, or the brain, or all these different areas. And so the big difference is somebody who's sort of researching this, right, and studying older adults versus somebody who they may still be researching it, right? But they're a physician who may be also responsible for providing that kind of care in those settings.
Thank you both for an amazing discussion. Is there anything we missed or you'd like to bring up?
I don't think so. I think having a podcast like yours, Larry, is a wonderful thing to have to help with this conversation. I think that one of the takeaways I would say would be what Ben said. I think we start exposing people to issues about getting older way too late. I think we need to start that much earlier than we do. So middle school and high school, we ought to be having a section in anybody's class about that. That only happens, and I would say I've only really done that when I've done studies or because I've been a parent, an older parent of young kids. And I'm a gerontologist.
Yeah, I think it's that was the one thing for us, right? This was a challenging, painful time, right? Given that we were, for everyone watching that and understanding that how that rhetoric is sort of being disseminated. At the same time, for me, I was like, okay, but maybe then this is a moment where we're going to start having these conversations a little bit more and start doing so in a constructive way. And so I think, what I would hope is that anyone who's watching this, who's a gerontologist or a geriatrician, is thinking about ways that we can have them more positive, have that conversation more constructively, but also have them earlier. Right? Have them with people before, as I think Pam will tell you, she does all this work with guardianship. The time to have that conversation is not when when there's an acute event. The time to have that conversation is as early as possible, right? And so that's, I think, something that we have to do a lot better job of promoting.
Once again, thank you both for a terrific discussion. I think maybe we can open this conversation up. Thanks again for coming on specifically for seniors.
Larry, it's a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
If you found this podcast interesting, fun, or helpful, tell your friends and family, and click on the follow or subscribe button. We'll let you know when new episodes are available. You've been listening to Specifically for Seniors. We'll talk more next time. Stay connected.